There was a man who believed that respect had to be earned every single day, not through character, not through discipline, not through patience, but through proving himself. If someone insulted him, he answered. If someone doubted him, he explained. If someone challenged him, he fought back. If someone ignored him, he tried harder to be noticed. And if someone walked away from his life, he chased them until they came back. He believed this was strength. He believed powerful men never allowed themselves to be disrespected. He believed that if someone tried to make him look weak, he had to immediately show them that they were wrong. So he reacted to everything. A small insult could ruin his entire evening. A careless comment could stay inside his head for days. A friend ignoring his message could make him question the entire friendship. A stranger laughing at him could make him wonder what he had done wrong. He was constantly watching, constantly thinking, constantly reacting, and he called it awareness. But it was not awareness, it was dependence. He had unknowingly given other people the remote control to his emotions, and the worst part was that he did not even realize it until one evening when a stranger said something that changed the way he looked at his entire life. The man was walking through a crowded marketplace just before sunset. The streets were filled with merchants shouting prices. Children were running between the stalls. Horses were moving slowly through the narrow road, and the smell of bread and smoke filled the air. He had just finished a difficult day, and all he wanted was to reach home. But as he passed a wooden table near the center of the market, he heard laughter behind him. He stopped for a second. Then he turned around. 3 men were sitting together. One of them looked directly at him, then smiled and said, "There goes another man pretending to be important." The other 2 laughed. The man felt his chest tighten. His first instinct was immediate. Turn around, walk back. Ask them what they meant. Demand an explanation. Make them regret saying it. For a moment, he actually took one step backward. His mind was already creating arguments. He imagined everything he could say. He imagined proving them wrong. He imagined the crowd realizing that he was not weak. He imagined the man becoming embarrassed for insulting him. But then something strange happened. He stopped. He looked at the 3 men for 1 second and then turned around. Again, he kept walking. He did not look back. He did not answer. He did not defend himself. He simply continued down the street. At first, it felt almost impossible. His body kept moving, but his mind was still standing in that marketplace. His thoughts were screaming at him. Go back. Tell them who you are. Make them respect you. But he kept walking. He reached the end of the street and still did not turn around. He entered another road and kept going. He crossed a small bridge and still did not turn around. He finally reached his home and closed the door behind him. He stood there in silence. His heart was still beating faster than normal. He had not fought anyone. He had not said anything. He had not proved anything. And yet he felt exhausted. That night he could not sleep, not because of what the men had said, but because of what he had finally noticed. He had spent years allowing strangers to decide how he felt about himself. A stranger could call him weak, and he would feel weak. A friend could praise him, and he would feel powerful. A woman could admire him, and he would feel valuable. A person could ignore him, and suddenly he would question his worth. He realized that his emotional state had become a public property. Anyone could walk into his mind and change the weather. And for the first time, he asked himself a question he had avoided for years. What if I am not actually strong? What if I am simply good at reacting? The thought disturbed him because he had built his entire identity around appearing strong. He had always believed that strength meant having an answer, but now he wondered whether real strength might mean not needing one. The next morning he left the city before sunrise and walked toward the hills outside the walls. There was an old philosopher who lived there, a quiet man who rarely spoke and almost never gave direct advice. People came to him because he had a strange ability to make complicated problems look simple. The man found him sitting outside a small stone house watching the sunrise. He sat down without saying anything. The philosopher looked at him and waited. After several moments, the man finally said, "I think I have spent my entire life trying to make people respect me." The philosopher did not react. He simply asked why. The man said, "Because I thought that if I did not defend myself, people would think I was weak." The philosopher asked, "And if they think you are weak, what happens?" The man paused. He said, "Then they will not respect me." The philosopher looked at him and asked again, "And if they do not respect you, what happens?" The man became irritated. He said, "Then people will take advantage of me." The philosopher smiled slightly and asked, "And if someone takes advantage of you, what happens?" The man said, "I lose." The philosopher looked toward the sunrise and said, "You are already losing." The man looked at him. The philosopher continued, "You are losing every time someone can control your emotions with a sentence. You are losing every time you abandon your peace to defend an image. You are losing every time you let another person's opinion determine your value." The man remained silent. Those words were uncomfortable because they were not insulting him. They were exposing him. He had spent years thinking he was protecting himself, but Perhaps he had been protecting an image instead. The philosopher then asked him a question that would stay with him for the rest of his life. What part of this belongs to you? The man did not understand. The philosopher explained, you cannot control what those men said. You cannot control what they believed about you. You cannot control whether they respected you. You cannot control whether they misunderstood you. You cannot control whether they liked you, but you can control what you do with their words. The man looked down. The philosopher said, your mind is the one place where you are supposed to be the ruler, but you have allowed strangers to walk into your kingdom without permission. The man felt something change inside him. The philosopher then told him about the Stoics. He explained that the Stoics never promised that life would stop hurting. They never promised that people would always be fair. They never promised that insults would disappear or that betrayal would never happen. Their lesson was much harder. They taught that the event and your judgment about the event are not the same thing. Someone can insult you. That is an event. Your decision that the insult makes you worthless is a judgment. Someone can reject you. That is an event. Your belief that rejection means you are not enough is a judgment. Someone can misunderstand you. That is an event. Your decision that you must spend hours proving yourself is a judgment. The man listened carefully. The philosopher said, you are not responsible for controlling the world. You are responsible for governing yourself. That sentence became the beginning of his transformation. He returned home that morning with no dramatic plan. He did not announce that he was changing. He did not tell his friends that he had discovered Stoicism. He simply decided to observe himself. For the next 30 days, he would watch every emotional reaction before acting on it. He would not become cold. He would not become cruel. He would not start manipulating people. He simply wanted to know how much of his behavior was actually his choice. The first test came that same afternoon. A man he knew sent him a message accusing him of being selfish. The message was short and harsh. Normally, the man would have answered within seconds. He would have written a long explanation. He would have reminded the person of every favor he had ever done. He would have explained his intentions and defended his character. He would have ended the message by asking whether they understood him. But this time he placed the message on the table and walked away. He told himself, I will answer when I am calm. 1 hour passed, then 2, then the entire evening. The next morning he read the message again. Something had changed. The words were exactly the same, but they no longer had the same power over him. He could see them without feeling attacked. He could examine them without immediately needing to defend himself. And then he noticed something important. The accusation had not changed his character. It had only challenged his ego. He realized that his first instinct was not always the truth. His first instinct was often simply his ego demanding protection. He began studying this pattern everywhere. He noticed that anger wanted immediate action, fear wanted immediate reassurance, pride wanted immediate defense, insecurity wanted immediate validation. But wisdom often asked for something completely different. Wait, he started creating a space between what happened and what he did next. That space became his greatest weapon. It was not silence for the sake of appearing mysterious. It was not silence as a manipulation tactic. It was simply the ability to pause before emotion became behavior. He discovered that many problems disappear when you refuse to react while emotional. A message that looks offensive at midnight can look meaningless the next morning. A criticism that feels like an attack in the moment can sometimes contain useful information. A disagreement that seems like a battle can sometimes be solved with one calm sentence. And an insult that once demanded an answer can sometimes be left where it was spoken. He began asking himself a new question. What response serves my future? When someone insulted him, he asked, what response serves my future? When someone tried to provoke him, he asked, what response serves my future? When someone tried to make him feel guilty, he asked, what response serves my future? When someone ignored him, he asked, what response serves my future? When someone challenged his character, he asked, what response serves my future? That question slowly changed his behavior. He started realizing that not every battle was a battle. Not every disagreement was important. Not every accusation deserved a defense. Not every person deserved access to his energy. And not every relationship deserved to be saved. He had always believed that walking away meant losing. But now he started wondering whether some things were actually losses only because he had been trained to chase them. He remembered how many times he had begged people to stay. He remembered friendships where he had done all the work. He remembered conversations where he apologized just to end an argument, even when he had done nothing wrong. He remembered people who insulted him and then called him sensitive when he reacted. He remembered people who demanded loyalty but never gave it back. He remembered people who constantly criticized him but called it honesty. And he finally saw the pattern. pattern. He had been teaching people how to treat him by showing them what he would tolerate. The realization was painful but freeing. He understood that boundaries are not punishments. Boundaries are information. They tell people where your participation ends. He began saying no without writing an essay, explaining why. He began leaving conversations when they became disrespectful. He began refusing to argue with people who were committed to misunderstanding him. He began accepting that some people would call him selfish simply because he was no longer available for everything. And this is where his life became more difficult before it became better. Because when you change the way you behave, people who benefited from the old version of you often notice first. One friend told him, "You have changed." The man said, "I know." Another said, "You think you are better than us." He said, "No, I just think differently now." Another said, "You used to be easier to talk to," he replied. "Maybe I was easier to control." The friend became angry, but the man did not argue. He simply left. That was something new. He was learning that not every accusation needed an answer. Some people do not ask questions because they want information. They ask questions because they want to control the conversation. Some people do not criticize because they want you to improve. They criticize because your growth makes them uncomfortable. Some people do not want the truth. They want you to confirm their version of you. And if you spend your life trying to satisfy every version of yourself that exists inside someone else's mind, you will never become anyone at all. This was where the man began reading more deeply about power and human behavior. He studied the works of philosophers. He studied history. He studied leaders. He studied people who had influence and people who had lost it. And eventually, he came across the ideas of Machiavelli. What interested him was not the cruelty that people often associate with Machiavelli. What interested him was his understanding of perception. Machiavelli understood that people do not always respond to reality. They respond to what they believe reality to be. They watch behavior. They interpret signals. They notice confidence. They notice hesitation. They notice desperation. They notice consistency. And this taught the man another important lesson. If you constantly tell people that you are confident, they may begin wondering why you need to say it. If you constantly tell people that you are powerful, they may start looking for the weakness underneath. If you constantly tell people that you are loyal, they may start asking why you need to prove it. Real strength rarely needs constant advertisement. A person who knows his value does not need to remind everyone every 5 minutes. A person who has discipline does not need to announce it. A person who is secure does not need to win every conversation. And a person who genuinely respects himself does not need to beg other people for respect. This was the paradox that changed the man. He had spent years trying to look strong when what he actually needed was to become stable. He had confused intimidation with strength. He had confused loudness with confidence. He had confused attention with respect. He had confused control over others with control over himself. And now he was learning the difference. The strongest person in the room is not always the loudest person. Sometimes it is the person who can remain calm while everyone else is losing control. Sometimes it is the person who can hear an insult without becoming an insulted person. Sometimes it is the person who can walk away from an argument without feeling like they lost. Sometimes it is the person who can say I was wrong without feeling destroyed. Sometimes it is the person who can say no without feeling guilty. And sometimes it is the person who can let someone leave without chasing them. The man started practicing these things one by one. He began waking before sunrise. He exercised when he did not feel like exercising. He read when he wanted entertainment. He sat in silence when he wanted distraction. He stopped checking his phone every few minutes. He stopped measuring his worth by how quickly people responded to him. He stopped posting things simply to receive approval. He stopped explaining every decision to people who had not earned an explanation. He started becoming comfortable with being misunderstood. This was perhaps the hardest lesson of all, because most people want to be understood, but the desire to be understood can become a trap. You begin explaining. You explain again, then again. You give more details. You provide evidence. You tell your entire story. You reveal your private thoughts, and still the other person may choose not to understand you. The man finally accepted something painful. You can explain the truth perfectly, and someone can still choose to believe a lie, and there is nothing you can do about that. Once he understood this, he became lighter. He stopped trying to force clarity into minds that were committed to confusion. He stopped chasing people who had already decided to leave. He stopped defending himself against every rumor. He stopped trying to correct every opinion, and slowly, something strange happened. People started treating him differently. Not everyone. Some people became more distant. Some became angry. Some accused him of becoming arrogant, but others began respecting him more. And the difference was not that he had become aggressive. He had simply become consistent. He no longer changed his behavior depending on who was watching. He no longer said yes to one person and no to another because he feared their reaction. He no longer laughed at jokes that disrespected him. He no longer stayed in conversations that repeatedly crossed his boundaries. His words became fewer but more meaningful. His actions became slower but more deliberate. And his silence became different. It was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of choice. One evening he met an old friend at a small restaurant. The friend looked at him and said, "You are different now." The man smiled and asked, "Is that a bad thing?" The friend said, "I do not know. You used to care about what everyone thought of you." The man replied, "I still care about people. I just stopped letting their opinions control me." The friend looked at him for a moment and said, "That sounds like a dangerous way to live." The man smiled and said, "Maybe, but it is much more peaceful." The friend laughed and changed the subject. The man realized something important. He had not become a different person. He had simply removed the chains that had been around him for years. And that is what many people misunderstand about personal growth. They think becoming stronger means adding something to yourself. More confidence, more knowledge, more money, more status, more followers, more attention, more achievements. But sometimes growth means removing things. Removing the need for approval. Removing the fear of rejection. Removing the addiction to being understood, removing the habit of reacting, removing the desire to prove yourself, removing relationships that constantly drain you, removing the identity that was built around other people's expectations. The man had spent years collecting opinions. Now he was learning to collect principles. He needed fewer people to tell him who he was because he was finally deciding for himself. And this changed his relationship with failure too. Before he would hide every mistake because mistakes threatened his image. Now he could admit them. He could say, "I was wrong." He could say, "I do not know." He could say, "I need to learn." He could say, "I made a bad decision." And strangely, those admissions made him stronger because insecurity needs perfection, but confidence can tolerate imperfection. He stopped pretending to know everything. He stopped trying to win every debate. He stopped correcting people when correction was unnecessary. He stopped speaking simply to appear intelligent. He began listening more, and the more he listened, the more he noticed how much people reveal when you do not interrupt them. People tell you what they fear. People tell you what they want. People reveal what they value. They reveal what makes them angry. They reveal what makes them jealous. They reveal what they need from you. And when you stop rushing to defend yourself, you start seeing other people more clearly. This was another lesson he learned from studying human behavior. People are often predictable, not because they are simple, but because they repeat patterns. The person who constantly breaks promises will probably break another promise. The person who always needs attention will probably continue seeking it. The person who repeatedly disrespects boundaries will test them again. The person who only appears when they need something will probably disappear when you need them. And the man finally stopped judging people by what they promised and started judging them by patterns. He realized that words tell you what someone wants you to believe. Actions tell you what they actually believe. This did not make him cynical. It made him observant. He still trusted people, but he trusted slowly. He still loved people, but he loved without abandoning himself. He still gave people chances, but not unlimited chances. And he still forgave. But forgiveness no longer meant allowing the same behavior repeatedly. He learned that forgiveness and access are different things. You can forgive someone and still keep distance. You can wish someone well and still refuse to walk beside them. You can love someone and still understand that they are not good for your life. This was difficult because he had once believed that being a good person meant always being available. But now he understood that constant availability is not goodness. Sometimes it is fear. Sometimes it is guilt. Sometimes it is a need to be needed. And sometimes it is simply the inability to disappoint people. He began testing himself. Whenever he felt guilty for saying no, he asked, "Am I actually doing something wrong? Or am I simply uncomfortable because someone else is disappointed?" The answer often surprised him. He discovered that guilt is not always evidence of wrongdoing. Sometimes guilt is simply the emotional price of changing an old pattern. And once you understand that you stop obeying every feeling you experience, you can feel guilty and still say no. You can feel afraid and still act. You can feel angry and still remain silent. You can feel rejected and still walk away. You can feel lonely and still refuse to return to people who hurt you. Emotional control does not mean feeling nothing. It means feeling everything without becoming a slave to every feeling. The man finally understood that this was the difference between suppression and discipline. Suppression says I should not feel this. Discipline says I feel this, but I choose what happens next. That distinction changed his relationship relationship with anger. Before, anger was an instruction. Now anger was information. It told him something had crossed a boundary. But anger did not get to choose his response. It could speak, but it did not get to drive. The same was true for fear. Fear could warn him, but it could not command him. Pride could protect his dignity, but it could not control his mouth. Desire could motivate him, but it could not control his decisions. And sadness could exist without becoming his identity. He became more emotionally aware because he became less emotionally obedient. And this was when the people around him started noticing something even deeper. He was becoming difficult to provoke. A person tried insulting him. He smiled. Another tried embarrassing him. He stayed calm. Someone tried making him jealous. He ignored it. Someone tried threatening to leave. He said, "I understand." Someone tried guilt-tripping him. He asked them to be direct. Someone tried pulling him into gossip. He changed the subject. Someone tried turning him against another person. He refused to participate. And the more he practiced more freedom he felt. The world had not become nicer. People had not suddenly become better. His life had simply stopped depending on their behavior. That is a level of freedom most people never experience. They spend their entire lives waiting for the outside world to become peaceful before they allow themselves to be peaceful. They say, "I will be happy when people respect me. I will be confident when people accept me. I will be calm when my problems disappear. I will feel valuable when I achieve more." But the Stoic understands that this is backwards. You do not wait for the world to become manageable before you build an unmanageable mind. You build the mind first. Then the world loses some of its power over you. The man was finally learning this, but his biggest test had not arrived yet. It came several months later when someone he deeply trusted betrayed him. It was not a stranger. It was someone he had defended many times, someone he had supported when nobody else did, someone he had helped without asking for anything in return. One morning he discovered that this person had been speaking badly about him behind his back. They had shared private information. They had mocked his ambitions. They had told others that. He thought he was better than everyone, and worst of all, they had done it while smiling to his face. The old version of the man would have exploded. He would have confronted them immediately. He would have demanded answers. He would have listed everything he had done for them. He would have wanted them to feel guilty. But the new version did something different. He sat alone for several minutes and allowed himself to feel the pain. He did not pretend it did not hurt. It did. He did not tell himself that betrayal was meaningless. It was not. He simply refused to let pain make the decision for him. He thought about the philosophers. He thought about control. He thought about character. And then he asked himself the question that had become the foundation of his life. What part of this belongs to me? Their choice belonged to them. Their words belonged to them. Their betrayal belonged to them. His response belonged to him. He could not change what they had done, but he could decide what kind of person he would become because of it. He eventually met the person face to face. They sat across from each other in silence. The other person looked nervous. The man finally said, "I know what you said about me." The friend looked down and began explaining. "There was a misunderstanding. I was angry. I did not mean it like that. I was only joking. I was going through a difficult time." The man listened. He did not interrupt. When the explanation ended, he simply said, "I understand." Then the friend asked, "Are you angry?" The man thought for a moment and said, "I am disappointed." The friend asked, "Can we fix this?" The man looked at him and said, "I do not know." The friend expected anger. Instead, he heard calm. And that calm was more powerful than any shouting could have been, because the man was not trying to punish him. He was simply deciding whether trust could still exist. He had learned something important. Forgiveness does not require forgetting, and trust does not have to be restored simply because an apology was offered. Sometimes an apology repairs a relationship. Sometimes it only closes a chapter. The man eventually forgave the friend, but he did not return to the old relationship. He wished him well and moved on. And for the first time in his life, he did not feel guilty for protecting himself. He understood that compassion without boundaries can become self-destruction. He understood that loyalty without judgment can become foolishness. And he understood that being kind does not require being available to everyone. This was the beginning of a deeper philosophy. He began living by a simple rule. Give people respect until their actions repeatedly show that they cannot handle it. Give people trust slowly. Give forgiveness freely when you can, but give access carefully. Because access to your life is not a human right. It is a privilege. And the older he became, the more he realized that life is too short to spend it trying to convince everyone of your goodness. There will always be someone who dislikes you. There will always be someone who misunderstands you. There will always be someone who thinks you are arrogant, selfish, weak, strange, or difficult. There will always be someone who tells a story about you that is not true. And if you make your peace dependent on correcting, all of them, you will never have peace. The man eventually returned to the marketplace where his transformation had begun. The same streets, the same merchants, the same noise, the same people, and near the same wooden table, he saw the three men again. One of them recognized him and smiled. Look, the important man has returned. The others laughed. The old version of him would have stopped. The old version would have defended himself. The old version would have tried to prove that he was not arrogant. But this time he simply looked at them, nodded, and continued walking. One of the men shouted, "You are not even going to defend yourself." The man stopped for a moment. He turned around and calmly said, "I have nothing to defend." Then he walked away. And for the first time, he did not feel like he had won an argument. He felt like he had won himself. That was the victory he had been searching for his entire life. Not defeating another man, not gaining approval, not receiving applause, not forcing respect, but becoming impossible to control through other people's opinions. And that is the lesson most people learn too late. You cannot build a peaceful life while constantly negotiating with everyone else's expectations. At some point, you have to decide who you are, and then have the courage to live as that person, even when nobody applauds, even when nobody understands, even when someone calls you arrogant, even when someone calls you selfish, even when someone says you have changed. Because sometimes changing is exactly what saved you, and sometimes the people complaining about your boundaries are the same people who benefited from you having none. Remember that. The moment you stop chasing respect, you begin building character. The moment you stop chasing approval, you begin building identity. The moment you stop reacting, you begin building emotional control. The moment you stop explaining everything, you begin protecting your peace. And the moment you stop trying to control everyone around you, you finally begin mastering yourself. That is the kind of power no one can take from you. But this was only the beginning, because learning not to react was one thing, learning how to live without needing approval was another. And the next lesson would force the man to confront something much deeper, his fear of being alone. He had learned how to walk away from arguments. But could he walk away from people? He had learned how to ignore insults. But could he ignore the fear of abandonment? He had learned how to control anger. But could he control loneliness? And that would become the hardest battle of his life, because it is easy to say, you do not need any